Hola. Buenas tardes. My name is Steve Fales. I'm a professor of agronomy here in the agronomy department at Iowa State. I'd like to thank you for coming this afternoon. We're going to show you a quick snapshot of an experience we had early this summer. And I hope you enjoy it. Essentially, the mission behind this trip originated with this colloquium. As part of the colloquium, I had queried the students whether they might want to see what the agricultural situation was in Cuba, particularly in view of the question, what would happen in America or the rest of the world if the petroleum plug got pulled? What would happen to our food system? And we've talked about that for some time and came to the conclusion that, you know what, there's a place where this happened. It happened back in the early 90s in Cuba. Next question was, gee, could we go there? Could we take a group there? So to make a long story short, with Shelley Taylor's help, you just don't call a travel agent and sign up to go to Cuba. So we were able to make this happen. I recruited 5 graduate students and 1 faculty member, Mary Wiedenhoeft, to join us in May of this year. So here's our question. What is the real Cuba? This is what you see on the government website that's aimed at the emerging tourist industry in Cuba. We didn't see any of this. Where does this thing go here? Oh, let's use this other one. Or is this more the real Cuba? Is it Cuba that is emerging from a very difficult time, but is doing so based on principles of sustainability? This is more like what we saw. So let me introduce the cast of characters, and you'll get to hear from them. Angie, raise your hand. Angie. John? Where's John? John's right here. Kate is defending her thesis, so she's not here. That's a heck of an excuse, isn't it? And Javier. Whoops. Wait a minute. Here he is. Courtney. Mary. And me. So what you're going to hear today is not definitive in any way, because we were only here for just a little over a week. It's really, what you're going to hear is our impressions. That's what we came away with. It's lots of questions. So what we're going to offer you now is just a context and some of our experiences and what we took away from it individually. Okay, but first, before we do that, we need to introduce the ultimate character in the cast, and that is Cuba herself. So what I want to do, and we're going to do for a few minutes here, is set the context in terms of the Cuban economy, Cuban geography, some agronomic things, and after I finish, Mary's going to talk a little bit about the recent Cuban history so you actually have a better idea of the context of modern Cuba. Okay, Cuba is an island in the Caribbean. It's 90 miles from Florida. It's about the size in area of Ohio. Okay, has a population of just over 11 million people, and it's in the tropics. Has a tropical climate that is moderated by the strong trade winds that blow from east to west, and is also impacted quite regularly from hurricanes. The feature of the geography here is 3 main mountain ranges in the east, in the center of the country, and in the west of the country that are surrounded by what I'd call rolling plains. Okay, Havana's here, of course. Guantanamo is here. The Bay of Pigs is here. We were headquartered in Havana and traveled out to this region, which is primarily a coffee and tobacco growing region. As far as economics, Cuba is it really has changed, and maybe we'll get into that later. It was formerly, from the beginning of history here, or at least economic history, a major sugar producer, third in the world. Now it produces no sugar, essentially. Okay, the market collapsed, and some other things happened too. So right now we have tobacco in the center of the country, in the west, a little bit in the east, rice production in the west, and spotty around, and coffee. And there's some citrus. I don't have it shown here. But with these commodities, henequen, anybody know what that is? Yeah.
It's fiber.
Right. It kind of looks like a palmetto or something. It's a fiber crop. Okay. These crops, along with some mining, predominantly nickel, actually, make the bulk of the export products for income for the state of Cuba. Okay. What else am I say about that? We're going to come back to the soils in a minute. So I'd like to now turn this over to Dr. Wiedenhoeft, Mary, and here you go. And I'll come back. Get disentangled.
Thanks, Steve. So when Steve asked me, he popped his head in my office and said, "Do you want to go to Cuba?" Yes. Well, okay, maybe I better ask my husband if it's okay that I go for a week or something. But the reason I wanted to go to Cuba was a couple of things. One is I had some colleagues when I was at the University of Maine in the mid-'90s who went to Cuba, and that was just so fascinating to hear their story, and I've always wanted to go to Cuba, so it was on my bucket list kind of thing. And two is that the whole idea of what happens when there's no longer peak oil, what happens when peak oil ends, and to see a case study so close to us in a way, and how did that happen? But here's the thing. I didn't really know very much about Cuba, so that part of that is my ignorance. And part of it is we don't really learn anything about Cuba because it is the forbidden country. And all I knew was Ricky Ricardo. Okay. Do you guys know who that is? Oh, I thought, I was going to date myself. Not that I saw the originals, but pretty close. Okay. The Bay of Pigs, but I didn't really quite understand what happened there. And then why it is such a forbidden country. And so what I found very interesting is understanding the history of Cuba. And I want to give you just a really quick, short lesson on the history. And the history is from 1959 to present. Now, Cuba was a Spanish colony. They broke away from Spain for independence in something like 1898 or something like that, which is the Spanish-American War. That's a part of it. So we've been connected to Cuba for really a very long time. Before the revolution, this is what was happening. There was sort of an imperialism. There was an imperialism. A lot of Americans owned land in Cuba, so Cubans did not own their land. It was a tourist place. It was where the rich and mafia hung out. It was the Ricky Ricardo kind of era, the big band kind of era, and it was really a very touristy place. Additionally, the major crop, and it was a monoculture, so just huge fields of sugarcane, and that's what they exported. However, even though lots of people were making money, it was not the Cubans. It was not the people farming, and it was not the individual citizens, but all that money was being extracted away. And so there was a lot of poverty both in the rural and in the urban areas. So because of that, that really set up a great situation for a revolution. And the revolution goals were this: that this U.S.-owned land would now become owned by the Cubans. And what happened, so to eliminate the U.S. domination. So they wanted to remove the domination from the U.S. They wanted to diversify their cropping system so that they weren't putting sort of all their eggs into one basket. They didn't have a monoculture. They wanted to improve rural life, so working with the poverty both in the rural and the urban areas. So this was the goal that Castro had for the revolution. So the revolution happened in 1959, but what happened after the revolution isn't quite what he had planned. So at the same time, the Americans sort of shut off all trade to Cuba, but Cuba needed trade. They needed the exports and the imports. And so what they did was they substituted the U.S. with the Soviet bloc. So the Soviet Union then became their importer and their exporter. The Soviets paid 5 times the world price for sugarcane. So that was incredibly great. And so what happened is that they continued a monoculture of sugarcane. So that diversity of cropping systems never happened. The Soviets provided a lot of egg imports, and the Soviets had adopted the Green Revolution ideas, and so Cuba itself adopted the Green Revolution. 80% of the land was state-owned, so all of that U.S. land then became owned by the state. However, the majority of the land was not very productive, or they were not very efficient. And so even though the Cubans owned the land, it was a system that didn't allow for a lot of good productivity. The bottom line was that they had adopted the Green Revolution. They were looking for high yields, lots of input, lots of chemicals, and that their Cuban agriculture became very fossil fuel dependent. Now, that sounds real. All those things seem very negative compared to what Castro had wanted for the revolution. He was, however, successful relative to the social aspects of the revolution, and that Cuba was far and ahead of any other Latin American country relative to the GNP, relative to life expectancy. Everybody was educated. There was low unemployment. And so he was successful in those goals of the revolution, but not on the ag side. So then in 1990, Castro announced that things were going to be a little different. I don't know if he realized how different it was going to be, but a week later, the Soviet Union dissolved. And I don't know how many of you were alive at that time. Okay, but it was, for those of us who were a little more conscious of it, it seemed to be like that. It was no warning. Maybe there was warning in Europe, but as far as people looking in, it just seemed like it happened like that. And that's what happened to the Cubans. They were really caught off guard. And suddenly, your best exporter and your best importer, gone. And your source of oil, gone. Okay? And at the same time, not only are you down, oh, this is a value statement, but not only are you down, but the U.S. tightened trade even more. Okay? So, tough. Okay? So Fidel steps up and says, we're going to have a special period in the peacetime. So this was not a wartime special period. This was in peacetime special period. And what happened, and you're going to hear more about, they talk about this special period as a really incredibly important time in their history. So it lasted generally from 1990 to 93, although you can still see results of it or consequences of it, or we did. 30% reduction in caloric intake. They were below FAO standards. Lack of food security, and it was not the poor, it was across the board. Poor or rich, urban or rural. And actually rural were a little bit better because they could produce their own food where the urban people could not. They had become so dependent on the Soviet Union and so dependent on imports that they couldn't survive. So they had a reduction to lots of different things, anything connected to oil. There was a reduction. There was a lot of things shutting down, lack of, no electricity, that kind of thing. However, this amazes me, is that education and medical needs remained free. So that piece that was so important to Castro and that he was successful at, he continued with that. Now, so at the same time then, Castro realizes that he needs to do something to feed his people. And so he starts an agricultural reform, and it's going to become the priority of the country. So first of all, the state farms were dissolved. He realized that they were ineffective or not very productive, and so they started to do land reform where they gave land back to the individual farmers. They started using alternative low input or sustainable or organic agriculture, partly because they didn't have the inputs, and they couldn't buy it from the U.S., and they didn't have the money to buy it anyway. Urban agriculture became really important, and the government facilitated that kind of new agriculture. And they started training farmers because they needed more farmers to work because of the model that they had adopted. all their tractors, if it broke down, they didn't have the parts, suddenly they had to have smaller farms in order to produce the food, and so they needed more farmers. Okay, so that sort of gives you an aspect of the history and some of the things that you're going to hear about the things that we learned about and what the people are still talking about.
Thanks, Mary. I hope that's informative. So what is the situation in Cuba? What are the trends over this period of time in terms of food and essentially soil and water resources? If you look at this, and I would say one thing, it's very difficult to get data for Cuba. I don't know if somebody knows of a website, a Cuban website that has up-to-date information or statistics, please let me know. The only source I could find was the USDA Foreign Agricultural Service in 2008. So I'll share some of this with you. So between 1961 and right in here is the special period, and you can see that over this time, non-agricultural land was decreasing, presumably because of industrialization and people moving off the farms and so on. But it remained flat at this beginning of from the beginning of the special period and forward. Land in permanent pasture was declining through the time preceding the special period, but began to increase as we were into the middle of it, as did permanent crops. And by permanent crops, we're talking about coffee, non-pasture permanent tree crops, citrus, and so on. And arable land actually began to decline. Why? That was primarily the sugarcane land that was going away. So that's just one piece of information there. Look at fresh water use. I will say one of the things we learned there, that they're really in a world of hurt with respect to water right now. They firmly believe, most everybody we talk to, that climate change has changed the water dynamics, and they're water deficient, and we could see it when we were there. It was supposed to be the wet season. Historically, it was dry as a bone. But anyway, with respect to the history that you just read about, you can see in 1990, when the end of the Soviet influence era, we had lots of water use through agriculture, primarily irrigation, a significant amount of industrial water use as opposed to earlier on. But that really, by 2000, year 2000, this is dramatically reduced. Again, reflecting the decline in industry, the decline in agricultural activity supported by irrigation and so on. Now, as Mary pointed out, also during this special period, which is in gray right here, the beginning of it, and this is an area where there's no data for some reason, you can see how the caloric intake declined to below 2,000 calories per day on average. Okay? This is very, very tough. And I don't know how many of you read about it or been there, but it's very obvious this was very difficult for the Cuban people. But now what I'd like to do is, I think it's important, we've set that sort of a background for you, and we'd like to have you hear from the Cuban people themselves, which is, they're the fourth person in the cast of characters. And Angie's going to do that for us. Okay. Angie will do that.
So while Mary's setting up the video, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the organization that you're going to be watching their video. It's Food First. How many of you are familiar with Food First? So about half of you. So the video is from 1996, so it's a little dated. Well, it's a DVD now. But many of the people who are in this footage that you'll see are people that we met with this summer. Food First, their mission is to eliminate social injustice and hunger. And so our tour that we were on definitely had this focus of looking at social sustainability in the food system. Global Exchange was their partner in setting up this tour for us, and they are an organization that's dedicated to promoting justice around the world through reality tours, they call them. So that's what we were on this summer, was a reality tour co-sponsored by Food First and Global Exchange. So we were definitely getting a certain take on the Cuban system, and we're very conscious of that. But I think that these two clips that we'll show you illustrate and give voice to what Mary and Steve were sharing, how the transformation took place, and then also the different practices that they put into place as they were converting conventional land into organic and sustainable land.
Every aspect of Cuban life was affected by the special period, but no change was as far-reaching as agriculture. Cuba had committed to the Green Revolution, a system which requires the massive use of fossil fuels in the form of natural gas-based fertilizers, oil-based pesticides, and diesel fuel for tractors and other farm machinery. The country's agriculture was more industrialized than any other Latin American country and exceeded the U.S. in its use of fertilizer.
The Cuban agricultural conventional Green Revolution system never was able to feed the people. You have high yields, but it was a lot oriented to the plantation agriculture, open economy. We export citrus, tobacco, sugarcane, and we import the basic things, 55% of the rice, more than 50% of the vegetable oil, of the oil and the lard that we consume. So the system, even in the good times, how people here remember, never fulfill the basic needs.
Cuba's agriculture began to falter as one problem after another halted production. Fuel and parts for tractors were almost impossible to find. Seeds, tools, animal feed, and vaccines were scarce.
Esto trajo como consecuencia que el de estar aquí era prácticamente una agricultura de supervivencia. Y los insumos que había de químicos ya no existían. Por ello que se dejó de la harina de trigo, los fertilizantes, los granos, el aceite. Fue un golpe muy fuerte. Y muchas personas pensaban que el proceso podía colapsar en 3 meses o 6 meses. Y realmente fue una etapa muy difícil para readaptar la economía a las nuevas condiciones.
The lack of fuel drove us to have a very big shortage of food.
So people, they end up squatting places in the city and growing food there without knowing how, because there were engineers, there were doctors, there was not farmers.
A drastic effort to convert every piece of arable land to organic agriculture was begun. During the special period, Cuba was able to help prevent famine through an urban agricultural movement.
Every vacant lot in the city was turned into orchard.
At first, urban gardening was an ad hoc local survival response to the crisis.
They needed food, they didn't know how, and they just did it, trial and error. And there wasn't space. They have a problem with garbage, dumping, rats, so they fixed all of those problems, get rid of the garbage and start growing things there.
Another thing during the special period was this identification of idle plots of land, right, that were cleaned up by the community and turned into agricultural gardens, urban agricultural gardens.
Hearing of the crisis, Australian permaculture experts came to Cuba to assist in developing new ways to garden and raise food.
So in October of 1993, the first 2 Australians came. And so we started to design the rooftop garden in that place. And after that, we got this small project. For us, it was a lot of money, $26,000 American dollars. And we started to do a train-the-trainer course.
They're one of the largest capacity centers for permaculture in Havana, and they themselves have trained over 400 people. Not only have, through these workshops and courses, has the community learned about permaculture, but they here in the center have learned a lot about the community. For example, if someone comes here and they have a health problem, they do whatever they can to help with that, but also they serve as kind of a reference point. They will go and look for the specialist and bring them here, so it's a mutual relationship.
The people cooperating with and caring about each other are the main factors that we need to encourage. We can all plant fruit trees, we can all have water catchment devices on our roofs. It's not the technology, it's the human relationships.
Distances.
The country has 169 municipalities. So 5 kilometers around the municipal towns also are considered urban agriculture. So it's a national system that is employing more than 140,000 people, actually. It's creating jobs. It's a growing sector of the economy, and it is very important. And we're very proud to say that.
Cuba eliminated the need for natural gas-based fertilizers and oil-based pesticides by developing organic farming methods. Fortunately, research centers had begun studying sustainable agriculture before the crisis. Because of this preparation, the transition to an approach to farming that didn't depend on fossil fuels was implemented nationally within just a few years. Without fossil fuels, more manual labor was needed, making smaller farms necessary and increasing the number of farmers.
One of the challenges, the peak oil challenges, is to reclaim land from the large-scale conventional agriculture.
Un suelo en formarse trata millones de años y en destruirse muy poco tiempo. Bueno, uno de los problemas que trae la tierra con químicos es la mineralización y la desaparición de la microflora y la microfauna, de la vida del suelo.
The soil is a living being. And in the topsoil, in the first 3 inches of soil, is the key. You add chemicals, you damage all of that. So then the soils became almost like sand.
So we're going to be having interesting challenges and to rehabilitate the soil.
Cuba found that it took from 3 to 5 years to make the land fertile and productive again.
Organic needs a transition, no? Needs some time and needs some money to establish the system, because when you get the soil is so damaged and dead that you need to rebuild the soil. You need to bring back the soil to life. You have to follow the natural cycles. So you hire nature to work for you, not work against nature. To work against nature, you have to waste huge amounts of energy. Conventional people use this heavy machinery that compacts the soil, huge tractor, huge combine trucks and things like that. So you have to open the soil again, add more nutrients. The first ethic, to take care of the land, of the earth. This is very important. If we don't take care of the earth will take care of us and get rid of us.
Entonces los institutos de investigación empezaron rápidamente a acomodar la agricultura a una agricultura orgánica, tanto desde el punto de vista de pesticidas como de nutrición.
For me, it's more important how the things that I'm eating are growing or are produced than what I'm eating. So if a vegan eats these heavily pesticide polluted vegetables, he's not doing much.
El hecho de empezar a utilizar materia orgánica empiezan a aparecer microorganismos y paulatinamente se va aumentando de acuerdo a los niveles de, por supuesto, sistemáticamente, porque si lo dejas de hacer vuelve a lo mismo, ¿no?
Cuba's new agriculture uses a variety of soil-enhancing alternatives to rebuild and maintain the soil. Crop rotation, composting, and green manure, which is a process of plowing young vegetation into the soil. Many tons of organic compost are produced, using kitchen scraps, rice hulls, and other organic matter. Worm humus is made in long troughs, where worms are fed organic waste products. This makes a richer fertilizer than regular compost.
Una tonelada de humo de lombriz equivale a 6 de materia orgánica.
Today, 80% of Cuba's agricultural production is organic.
The lack of fuel drove us to use less machinery, to go to smaller farms, to combine different crops in one small piece of land, preventing pest spreading.
If you have 1 million plants of corn, you will have 1 million bugs that eats only corn, and you have a pest.
We developed many biopesticides and many biofertilizers. Today we are even exporting to Central American countries and other Latin American countries. We are exporting biopesticides and biofertilizers. Remember, Cuba has one advantage. If the population of Cuba is 2% of the population in Latin America, Cuba has 11% of all the scientists in Latin America.
It's difficult to grow certain crops in Cuba's heat.
So Courtney, John, Javier, and I are going to share some of our impressions and questions that we had from our trip and then our conversations we've been having together through this fall and independent studies we've been doing. Can you all hear me? I guess I'm supposed to do this. Okay. A little further away? Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so you've heard this story, which I think is a wonderful story, and one that could be very relevant to us here in the United States. We have an organic research movement going on. It's relatively small by comparison to the large industrial research establishment, but like Cuba, it's behind the scenes. And like Cuba, if something happened, I would predict that organic agriculture would rush to the rescue in some form. But I think that we need a reality check on really the reality of the situation. Sure, as an agronomist, I have to do this. The fact is, as of 2008, it's best we can find. Now, again, data is very difficult to come by. 75% of Cuba's farmland is degraded to some degree. About 3 million acres, hectares, 45% are very low in fertility. These soils are calcareous, and at such a fairly high pH, but they've been extensively farmed for hundreds of years with very little concern about taking care of the soil. Originally, Cuba, the entire island was dominated by forest, mainly predominated by tropical trees such as mahogany. That's all gone. And sugar, hundreds of years of sugarcane really had a devastating effect on the soil. As you might expect, the soil is low in organic matter. There are salinity problems, 15% about, and about 2.5 million hectares, about 38%, exhibit medium to severe erosion effects. We could see that when we were there. The soil just didn't, it looked like, it was reminiscent of some soils I've seen in the southeast of the U.S. That had been devastated by years of cotton production. Okay, let's turn to one thing I think we need to visit about regarding the food system here. Although that story is very nice, the fact remains that between 60 and 80% of Cuba's food is imported, okay? In terms of food aid, commercial food imports. The stuff you just heard about represents the rest of it, okay? So between 30, 35, 40% of the food the Cubans eat is what they have grown on those farms you're just seeing. Okay, so you need to keep that in mind. They are desperately looking to change that balance to become more food secure and bring more of these state-owned lands back in production. 50% of the state-owned land right now is either not used or completely underutilized. And I defer to my colleagues here. I noticed this certainly traveling around this countryside, how much of the countryside was just in weeds and brush. It was amazing. Okay, so that's another fact. So how is it? It's a very complex food system. Okay, so you've got, say, commercial imports, food aid, that go really through state sector distribution. These imports go to the hotel, restaurant, industrial sector, or to the state, and there's state-run rationing outlets, which consist of various little grocery stores and shops and convenience stores. Very limited inventory. Okay, these are basically subsidized by the state. And for example, you could buy, I don't know, what did a Coke cost in pesos? So it was very cheap.
Yeah, about 5 cents.
About 5 cents for a Coke, okay. And you could get a Coke there, but it came from, I don't know, Venezuela or someplace. Or these other shops, and we're not going to get into this, we don't, but there's two levels of currency in Cuba. This one is basically pitched to the dollar. It's for the tourist industry to use. There are shops there too. What's the ratio? I think it's, what is it, 10 to 1 or whatever. Anything you buy on Cuban pesos costs at least 10 times more in convertible pesos. I forget exactly what that is. But anyway, these are all state-run. About 60% of the Cubans' food is actually rationed. These are basic foodstuffs: rice, beans, meat, which primarily consists of poultry. But it's through a ration system that is based on the number of people in your family. And then there's these state-run rationing through these little shops and so on. On the other side, there are some exports, we just talked about earlier, minor really in terms of the cash exchange into Cuba. And there's what they call non-state sector distribution through a formal economy and an informal economy. The informal economy is a nice way of saying black market and underground. And this formal economy, there are free agriculture markets, which we visited. What happens is if you grow vegetables in these gardens around the cities, you meet a quota that the state requires you to sell to them. Anything above that quota you can sell in these markets. And there are points of sale, which is individuals selling to one another, and so on. And through all of this, there's quite a bit of pilferage going on, and I call it corruption, but that's a fact of life. So it took us a while to figure this out, because nobody sat down and explained it to us. Very complicated system. Okay. Where are we now? Angie.
Thank you. So that set up really well, actually, what I'm going to talk about. So Mary or Steve, I forget who bought this book, but Yoani Sanchez has a blog. Are you familiar with her blog, Generation Y? She blogs from Cuba, and she released a book this year about it, and it's a memoir. But I wanted to share some readings from her blog with you about sort of the food system from an urban perspective, and I'll tell you a little bit about her blog in her own words. So this is from her website, Generation Y. In April 2007, I entangled myself in the adventure of having a blog called Generation Y that I have defined as an exercise in cowardice, which lets me say in this space what is forbidden in my civic action. To my surprise, this personal therapy earned me, in a short time, the attention of thousands of people around the world. Thanks to the virtual citizens network that has woven itself around Generation Y, I have been able to update this blog every week. Since March 2008, the Cuban government has enforced a computer filter that prevents seeing my blog from public internet sites in Cuba. So I need the solidarity of friends off the island to post my texts on the web. Thanks also to other volunteer collaborators. Generation Y is translated into 15 languages. So she has a pretty complex web of people around the world that she sends her blog posts to, who post them on her blog for her because she cannot do this from Havana. And so I'm going to read just 3 short blog pieces to you from her blog. This first one's from May 2007, and it gets into some of the diagram that Steve showed you about the different food markets. It's called New Status Symbol. I live equidistance from 2 agricultural markets, in one of which sellers are farmers, members of a cooperative or their respective intermediaries, and the other of which is run by the Youth Labor Army. In the first, there is nearly every fruit, vegetable, other food, even pork. The state market rarely has more than sweet potatoes, peppers, onions, and green papayas, and when there is some kind of meat, the lines are longer. But the fundamental difference between these two markets is not variety but price, so much so that my neighbors call the market run by the farmers the market of the rich, and the market run by the youth labor army the market run by the state the market of the poor. The truth is that to serve a fairly balanced meal, you have to go to both. First, you must inspect the stands full of the products that abound at the large market, and then consult the whims and capricious quality of the polished tomatoes in the market of the peasant farmers. Sometimes, overcome by desire and nostalgia, I buy a pineapple in the market of the rich, but I take care to bring a cloth bag to hide this queen of fruits, this obscene symbol of status, from the jealous glances of others. This next one's from February 2010, and it's called Protect Your Own, Steal from Others. At night he watches over rows planted with malanga and the flock of lambs with a short homemade shotgun. It is the work of an improvised gunsmith who welded a small diameter piece of pipe to a rustic chamber with an irregular hammer sticking out. The sound of the ingenious device is enough in the early hours of the morning to send running anyone who tries to steal the harvest. When the sow gives birth, he calls his brother who lives in the village, and with this contrivance, created by necessity, they keep watch until sunrise. Many farmers use illegal weapons that have been purchased or produced in an alternative way. Without them, the fruit of months of labor could end up in the hands of the predators of grain, elusive shadows who move in the darkness. Poverty has increased the stealing in the Cuban countryside and forced the villagers to safeguard their own resources. Hence the proliferation of aggressive dogs and manufactured shotguns, particularly on farms where there are cows. The pound of beef that sells for 2 convertible pesos in the black market feeds the thefts and illegal slaughter, despite the lengthy prison sentences that these crimes entail. And then one last one, and it's called Goodbye to Rationing, and this is from a year ago. Every day brings us closer to the New Year end. With it, the growing alarm over the job cuts and reductions in subsidies facing us in the coming months. A phrase from Raul Castro's latest speech, continuing on the edge of the precipice, is not a metaphor but our painful reality. Among the social assistance that will be eliminated is the so-called ration market, which distributes a small monthly quota of products to each citizen. No one can survive eating only what is recorded in his ration book, a document even more important here than our identity card. But extremely low wages and high prices in the country's other markets make the abolition of this subsidy dramatic and highly controversial. It is not only a basic, though meager, support, but it is like the birdseed that justifies the cage. Whenever the tone of criticism rises and dissenters begin to point to the system, officials emerge to remind us that the government spends millions each year to provide us a few beans, a packet of coffee every 30 days, and that slice of bologna that feeds popular humor more than stomachs. So it has been for more than 40 years, since the establishment of the regulated market. At the time, my parents thought it would be a temporary, a transitional measure until planned and centralized economy began to bear fruit. Within a few days of my birth, my name was inscribed in the Register of Consumers, and 20 years later I had to enter the name of my son in the same list. Rationing has become so ingrained in our lives that many do not know whether to laugh or cry at the news of its end. We are all aware that keeping the booklet is unsustainable for the national economy, but few can imagine life without it. In our house, we have decided to put the little book of graph paper we've been given for 2011 in a safe place, because if it really is the last one, surely it will become an historic document. Those who defend its immediate elimination are sure it will mean automatic appearance of tons of goods on the free market, and they assume this will cause prices to drop in this market not regulated by the state. But perhaps the biggest change might be in the minds of the people. When they sense that the tiny portion of seed is no longer being placed inside the cage, they may begin to feel the real pressure of each one of the bars. And so I shared these blog posts because I think it's easy when we're seeing that video and you hear a lot about agriculture in Cuba it's like our dream, right? Like the sustainable paradigm is the dominant paradigm there. And everyone's doing organic farming. And so it's easy to maybe romanticize that. And I think the article that we sent out, if you had time to read it, talks about food sovereignty in Cuba and indicators of food sovereignty, and I thought it gave a really realistic perspective because it talked about the capacity, which these interviews with the people in the video I think really spoke to the social capacity that's there for this transformation, but it was also pretty realistic in what is also not happening yet. And so if you get a chance to look at that article, I think that's really interesting, especially because we often talk here in terms of food security and insecurity and getting food to hungry people, but food sovereignty is something much more empowering. And so it's exciting to see that conversation in Cuba, and I think we have a lot to learn from it. So I'm going to hand this now. Courtney, I think, is next. What? Oh, I was supposed to introduce myself. I'm Angie Carter. My major is sociology and sustainable ag.
Introduce myself first. My name is Courtney Long. I'm a graduate student in Sustainable Ag in the Landscape Architecture Department. I'm going to talk more about my independent study than, I guess, my views and personal inputs on the travels. My thesis research is on local food access in inner cities, and that's kind of where I found Cuba to be of interest because I've heard a lot about their urban agriculture systems. So I've been comparing the urban agriculture systems in Cuba with things that are going on in the United States, such as in Kansas City or Detroit. And so I guess some of the interesting things that I've learned from Cuba is how it was started. So we've talked about the peak oil crisis, and it was from this crisis that they even started looking into these options, which is similar in the United States, but possibly, as you all know, that's not the crisis that we're facing yet, and that there are different social dynamics going on here in the United States versus in Cuba. So those have been definitely interesting comparisons that I've been looking at. Also, the government system in Cuba has also placed a lot of different restrictions. We talked about how the state farms kind of shifted and people were able to own the land again, but then there's co-ops and there's still state farms. There's all of these intricacies that you don't really hear about. So you see, like Angie had noted, you see these positive actions on the movie, but while we're there, things are still really hectic and there's a lot of barriers that are still going on. And you aren't able to kind of feel as happy about the movement as the video looks at it. We were able to see a few urban gardens and some areas that it's definitely personally run, community run. You can see where the interactions are locally versus co-ops having to mandate where the food goes. So that's kind of where my independent study was going and what I've been looking at, and some of my personal opinions, I suppose, have been influenced by how regulated is what we saw in Cuba. It was very planned. There was a definite agenda possibly behind what we were able to see, and then what you can see through books or through the blog and things like that. So, anyways, I'm going to branch it to John.
Hey, I'm John, and I'm a sustainable agriculture student as well as CRP, community planning. And so Cuba, to me, before I went, and I'm really just going to talk about personal experience for a couple of minutes because that's really all I got from the experience, because I thought of Cuba, and to be honest, I think as many of us are, I was ignorantly blissful of Cuba's existence. You know, I knew it existed, but I didn't really know anything about it, and I was happy it was there. You know, I felt like it was fighting the man, and I saw a video about it a few years ago, and learning about this special period, and the video was made in 1994 or 5, and I became intrigued with this idea of what would really happen if we lost our oil, and what would we do. And so Cuba became so fascinating to me, but that was about it because I didn't have any resources to really look at it. And so I had done plenty of independent travel and study throughout Latin America, and so you know I became more and more intrigued when I talked to people who traveled to Cuba, not to see agriculture, but just because of the food and the women and everything else that Cuba is known for outside of what we're studying, you know. And so I when this opportunity came about, I jumped on it, you know, and I came with this traveler's perspective that I can go to a bar and have a beer with anybody, and I'm going to learn on my own. It's going to be independent, and I think a lot of it was the trip and the way it was set up. It was very structured, But at the same time, I felt like I didn't learn. You know, again, like I said, I was ignorantly blissful. I was happy about Cuba before I came, when I returned from Cuba, I was just frustrated because it's so confusing. I have so many questions, and I have to go back now because, you know, for example, people will talk about how they don't have access to internet, and now I'm Facebook friends with people. You know, so there's contradictions. The government says that the unemployment rate is 2%, and then a gentleman we interviewed or we talked to on the trip, who was interviewed in the video, said that the unemployment rate in Cuba is more like 20%. So you never really know. You hear all these different contradictions, all these different numbers, and when you're there, you can only talk to so many people. And it's really important too, I think, when we discuss Cuba, as we have a little bit already, is that the change in agriculture and the systemic change that occurred in Cuba came out of necessity rather than desire. And so when you talk about the roots of change, where does that change really come from? Does it come from the desire before it's needed? And so Cuba's clearly came rapidly, and we saw how a group of strong people on an island in a very unique situation can come back and revitalize itself. However, when I was there and when I left, I'm concerned because that change came from a necessity, not a desire. I felt that there's still a desire to go back to the old times. I don't think that people necessarily, you know, they're happy that it's organic but they still want more money, just like everybody does. You know, so we again, I think Angie and some people have said that we romanticize Cuba. And I think that's completely true. And I think that we have to remember where change comes from when we look at Cuba, and know that when the doors do open, because I think they will open in the near future, I think that the change will come as rapidly in the other direction as it did during the special period. And so, A, go to Cuba now before it changes, and B, when the doors do open, you'll be able to go to a bar with anybody in Cuba, and it'll be a great time. But yeah, so you know, I'm here. I'm not an expert about Cuba. I can't teach you anything really about Cuba except my own experiences, my unique experiences. But I'm really looking forward to discussion and answers and questions this afternoon. So, thank you.
So, my name is Javier Cavazos.
The mic, because we are capturing this.
Oh.
We're recording.
My name is Javier Cavazos. I'm a poet in the MFA program here at Iowa State University. Mary Swander is my mentor. So I went as a writer, just kind of wanting to capture the aesthetic and the feeling, the emotion, you know, the trials and tribulations of the Cuban people. So I wasn't really, you know, as concerned about a lot of the issues that these guys were, but I was interacting with people on just a real, you know, human level. So one of the things that was disturbing, probably the most disturbing or the most heartbreaking, was the fact that they have a two-currency system. So there's the regular Cuban pesos, and then there's the CCUs, the convertible Cuban pesos, which is about 20-to-1 difference. So the convertible peso is really the money that's really sought after. It's the one that the Cubans want to have because it's worth the same amount as an American dollar there. So that creates a big problem with vice, and it also creates a big problem with just panhandling. And I know Shelley had talked with us in a meeting before, you know, was talking about be really careful not to give money and stuff like this. It doesn't matter where I am. I mean, I could be in Cuba, I could be here in Ames, Iowa, anywhere on the planet, and if someone asks me for money, you know, I'll kind of say something smart alecky to them because I was in that position many times, and probably will be many more in my life. But I always say, hey man, you gotta do something, man. You can't just just ask for money. You know, what can you do? You know, I used to stand around on a little box top and write people poems for $1. You know, so you know, do something for me. So Dr. Fales and I were walking along the Malecon, which is the boardwalk there in Havana, and on the other side are these really dangerous cement formations. They used to be old dock piers, boat piers, or you know, place for boats. So there was a group of kids there, and we're like, nah, man, nah. And I said, you got to do something, man. You got. And so then the one kid goes, oh, wait a minute. And then he runs and he gets another buddy of his, and they talk, and then the buddy comes back, and then they start setting up this. What they did is they stopped the traffic in the road that runs right along the Malecon, which is the boardwalk again. They stopped the traffic, and then two kids, like in an opening about this wide, one kid stood here, and another kid stood over here. And then the kid was way back over there behind the street, traffic, and they're holding up traffic, and then they say, okay, go. And then the kid runs across the lanes of traffic, hits this little narrow, marker that they're showing him. He can't see anything he's going towards. And in a full sprint, leaps off of it and clears everything, So it was like, oh, man, yeah, here's my money. Take it off. I mean, it was just incredible. It was like so dangerous. But the athleticism alone to make it, I mean, he had to have jumped at least 30 feet and then dove into just this little tiny opening of water, and then they all were happy they were splitting the money. So I tried, my whole thing there was trying to capture moments like that in poems for a collection of poems about Cuba. So this is called the Malecon. So you, the tourist, move in by air above the bay like a voyeuristic angel, and the Malecon in the buildings of central Havana establishes where you are. The rubble and ruin could be a beat-up Atlantic City, but it is not. You, the tourist, glide like a child's paper plane 1 foot above the bay and notice the 1559 Spanish fortress El Morro Castle, built to protect Spain's investment. This is where the reaping of humans and gold was stored before heading back across ocean. You smile as waves lap and crack shore rock, then turn in on each other and flip around like a graceful Olympic swimmer. Cool, says the wind as it exits left over the Malecon's edge and into the water where rock formations look like broken dock piers that once held boats closer than a tourist wallet. You settle in on a street corner in central Havana. You stand outside a hustle shop scam. Someone needs milk for their dying baby. Some other one needs 2 pesos to buy diapers. A woman wearing a light blue wrap on her head crosses your path from your right. You notice black and gray hair growing on her chin like miniature palm trees in the wind. One hair sways as she smiles, and she is staring at something further than you can see. You, the drained tourist, the babbling bleached body in the sun. You go inside a corner store building. It is a little store that wants to sell you some flowering pussy. Only you don't want to buy any, so you tell the man no, but thank you, and in a really nice voice. He laughs when you tell him no. A group of young boys enter the store and they ask for money. You tell them no again, their skin black and more beautiful than a shiny piece of tar heroin that entombs 10 years worse than a slammed gavel. You, the converted socialist, you, the Che Guevara hat-wearing chummy chum chum, and these kids want something from you, want something more than you can give. Don't be afraid to partake in the Santeria, chop a head off a chicken dinner, and the rumba in the street goes boom, boom, boom. How about a nice heirloom for the kids? One boy asks for a peso, 2 girls ask for 2, the sky bluer than the 63 Chevy that just passed outside as you shout, no, 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 and the jackhammer goes over the hustle of girls, over the 50 gallons of water for just one flush, over the collapse of the Soviet sickle crush, and just when you think you are about to give up on this place, a long palm tree of a silhouetted boy takes up the whole left side he entered the frame from. He is taller than the Christ by the Bay statue. He is blocking all of the sun and is darker than the asphalt of the People's Communist Square. He winks as he drops his watch on the floor as he runs past you out into the street, crossing lanes of traffic like a kickoff return, and you burn after him shouting, son, your watch, son, You dropped your watch, but you are too slow, and the young man is getting away like a launched shuttle. You burn after him, you say no, and he is getting away like someone leaving this earth. All you can do is think of the children swimming on the other side of the Malacon's edge this boy is running towards, the ones swimming in the dirty water below, the cement that looks like urban coral reefs that will crush him. You can't see any way he is going to make it over the crumbling mock pier and not crack open his head right in front of your eyes. But this boy is running with speed so fast the pesos in his pocket start to spin and make a Mario Brothers ching, 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 ching sound as he leaps off the top of the Malacon and out into the bay like a bomb exploding at the foot of a little girl, like an equation on the board sparking chalk into dust, and the boy does it. He clears the jump, clears everyone lying on the rocks, and the rocks themselves staring up in awe as the boy Jesse Owens the leap exploding beyond all of this heat and humidity, beyond all of this fear, beyond everything that is Cold War, and you, the pot-bellied tourist, do the only thing that is right. You open your wallet to him like a caught fish, split up the belly, your heart and blood rushing out.
Real quick, we have some representatives from the Socialist Workers Party here with us today, and they actually have some books in the back table that relate to Cuba, and we probably won't have a chance to discuss with them as a group this afternoon. You could talk to them. They're trying to set up a farmers exchange program where Cuban farmers can come to America and learn practices here, and then American farmers can go to Cuba and take their practices back to America. So, and I'm sure I missed a lot. Talk to them afterwards if you have a chance, because it's a good program.
Okay, well, thanks for your indulgence here. We have 15 more minutes, and what I'd like to do is ask the students to come forward and field any questions you might have. Aim them at the students, if you will. Anybody?
This is maybe an ignorant question and maybe also difficult to answer. So there's talk about the special period of the early 90s, and then you have some data from the 96 and such. And what I'm wondering about is the result of the collapse in oil was the Soviet Union collapsing, and the collapse of the food aid and high prices for the agricultural products. What I'm wondering is when the Bolivarian revolution started, when Chavez's government in Venezuela started giving aid, which I guess my first question is how did that aid compare to the aid that the Soviet Union sent? And then do we know what the impact of that was on, your question is what happens when Cuba gets opened up to the outside world, and it seems like that was something of an opening up to the outside world, and what was the impact?
Well, I know for sure that Cuba was almost entirely reliant upon the Soviet Union for its resources. Its food, in fact, if you want some cabbage, you can go to Cuba. And I think it was 90% of, I can't remember the exact resources, but it was 90% of just about everything came from the Soviet Union. I don't want to just throw out numbers, but that's a staggering number, right? But when you hear that, it was a staggering statistic, and I don't think that could ever be replicated in the future.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I know in our meetings with people, lots of times we would ask, oh, how do you get this here? And that's how they would get it, right?
What was how they would get it?
Oh, different food products or medicines or different things.
I mean,
from Venezuela.
Yeah.
But then, lots of times when they talked about everything that they could not get still. And so it was hard to, I don't know the answer to why some things and not others.
Castro got a new palace. He got a bigger budget, more exotic gifts for his girlfriends. That's about what happened.
We don't have the answer.
Let me help you out here a little bit. With respect to Venezuela, the Cuban government has signed a series of agreements where Venezuela is their chief trading partner right now. Essentially, what Cuba's trading for is they're trading their doctors for Venezuelan oil. Okay, but even the Venezuelan oil is not enough for Cuba, at least with the exchange arrangement they have. Venezuela is now building a refinery right in Havana. We saw it in the construction at the time we were there. The second trading partner is Brazil. So what they're doing is they said, okay, America, you're closer to us than anybody else, but we can do without you. In fact, we'll have partners in the Latin countries. So that's essentially exactly how much that's helping it.
Carol?
So how do the farmers work with the government? Is there a how does it work? You know, does the government redistribute the food for the population? How does that work?
It's complicated. We should have had a chart of all the different organizations and types of farm. But one of the gentlemen that spoke in the video who we met with was in charge of the National Organization of Forestry and Farm Technicians, and then also worked with the Organic Farmers Alliance. And it's like PFI, but at a national scale. And they're doing farmer-to-farmer assistance programs, and he acknowledged that they need a big paradigm shift there, like we do, that people don't really understand the reality of why they're raising the food this way, and that organic is just, by default, is not a standard that they have. And so, in thinking about future trends and how things might change, that there needs to be more outreach and education of people in understanding the process of their food and how it's being made. But we went to one cooperative, a coffee cooperative, and we went to another farm, which in the pictures where you saw people rolling cigars, it was a tobacco farm. But that had been historically their land before, right? But then they got it back.
And so they were selling 80% of their tobacco to the government, and so how the government distributes that would be dependent upon what they're doing. They could keep, 90% I think, and they kept 10%, and that 10% they could use for their own, or they could sell it. And so they were value adding to the tobacco and selling it as cigars, citrus-infused cigars, in order to get more income.
One of the peri-urban gardens that we visited, so they are obligated to sell so much to the state for schools and hospitals and daycares and things, but once they meet that quota, they can sell the rest of their farm stand there. Yeah, Steph?
To me, there's like a huge elephant in the room after I hear all this. I think John touched on it a little, of how they made this transition out of necessity rather than desire. I'm comparing and contrasting the U.S. because we always say, oh, what happens here? This was done under a dictatorship rather than a democracy.
Yes.
So I guess I'd leave that open.
Yeah, it's mandated. Their gardens, they showed us. So we noticed they were putting basil at the end of each row. No, why do you do that? Well, they have to. That's what their organic gardening, it's not just organic in practice, but they're mandated to do certain things.
And they're even changing the culture of how they think about eating food. So to the average Cuban, if you could generalize in that way, they're not excited about eating garden food. They just aren't. They're not excited about lettuce. They're not excited about cucumbers. They're not excited about onions. They're not excited about anything that kind of video showed as we're really doing it. It was really forced upon them. And one of the big things that we talked about with our guide, we had the best guide you could get. But that was the main concern is how do you get now all the people to appreciate this as a food way, as a real your choice of your diet, not because of what you have to. And one of the things that the video doesn't touch on is how desperate things got in the special period. I mean, people were starving. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds all across. So imagine if something happened here in Iowa or here in America, where all of us, 3 months from now, we're 20 pounds lighter than we are right now. That's pretty. It's like what we want, but we'll never go there. Not yet. It's coming, but
it's not out of desire.
Yeah. And so it was hard. They were actually putting things into, plastics. I heard a story of someone putting in plastics to kind of give a texture, to a certain texture of soups and in rice and just, it was that horrible of a time, So.
And I also want to add to one of your points, Stephen, is that with Cuba, even before the special period occurred, Cuba was arguably the most unique country in the world, and it continuously has become, it still is really one of the more, if not the most unique country in the world for the situation it's in. And for various reasons, whether it be the history of revolutions, or just simply because it's an island, and a pretty big island, 90 miles from Florida, and that's why we all went here, and that's the big elephant, is that what lessons can we glean from our experience and what's happening in Cuba and transfer them to our experiences? Because it's a unique case study, and we all talk about this in school and theory and stuff, and so we kind of understand that it's hard to generalize these theories, and that's why Cuba is so fascinating, and that's why it's so confusing and so damn frustrating.
I have a different opinion about Cuba, but I think that one thing that's really difficult for people in the United States about Cuba is that they made a revolution that was a workers' and peasants' revolution. And I don't think there's any way they could have gotten through the special period if it wasn't a revolutionary country. And it wasn't just agriculture. Every aspect of the society, every aspect, industry, education, electricity, blackouts, and all the rest, that a million different things that they had to confront, and they did so by turning to the people themselves and all the creativity that came out of that. And that could only have been done through a revolution. Just like wiping out illiteracy could have only been done after you made a revolution. And it's not just, that's the difficulty, is that you can look at Cuba, but you can't really take what it does and then apply it to an entirely different context for a country that is, like the United States, which is a capitalist country that has its class dynamics. So that's kind of my question, is that how much, or I just like to get reaction to that. And just so people know, I'm one of the people that John mentioned from the Socialist Workers Party. And so anybody that would be kind of intrigued or interested in this idea of bringing a couple of farmers from Cuba to the Midwest, I'd really be interested in talking.
There's an article by Pamela Stryker, who teaches at UC, one of the UCs, right? And she said she's done a lot of research in Cuba, and she said that over her years of research in Cuba, that she thinks that because they put social justice at the focus of their society, right, that this is some place where we might actually be able to see a sustainable food system emerge, because it is peasant to peasant and worker to worker and farmer to farmer, and they're doing this collectively. And so it's really different than a lot of the food movements that we see in the United States.
Yes, I'm wondering, it seems like one of the limiting factors continues to be is the water. But it seems like from some of the data, I'm just wondering if you have a perspective of next steps. I don't think things have changed and improved all that much in the last 10 years when a few of us were able to go with Iowa State in the year 2000. You got through the special period, there's some major advances, but as far as the extra land going into production, it doesn't sound like it's improved a whole lot as far as sustainability. Just wondering if you have a sense of that. And I know you talked about some of the barriers. Again, they would not have gone through the special period without the government that they had, but it's also a contributing factor of why maybe you're not making advances too. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense of that at all.
I might jump in on that. One of the things we did not mention is that the top priority after food is tourism. of that, we learned about the water situation there, how difficult it was. But, again, to the contradictions, under construction or completed right now are 19 golf courses. For tourists.
Yeah. And we even stayed, we stayed in a nice tourist place. I mean, I have to really say, we didn't get the average Cuban experience. And even there, we all went on this hike, and we all came back, and we're like, oh, we're going to go take showers. And we get in there, and none of the showers work. Because, there's no water, So, and then they had to do, I don't know what they did. I don't know where they got the water from, but, within a few hours, they had there. And then people in Havana, you saw pictures of it as you walked in, but it's a water truck. It comes once every other day. So you literally go out, if you live in the city in Havana, all the pipes, it takes 50 gallons of water to flush one toilet. I think here in America it's at 1 gallon, just barely over 1 gallon of water. So it takes, and that's because the pipes, the infrastructure of all their sewage, of all their plumbing, it's shot. Nothing's been improved upon since the 40s and 50s. It'd be taking New York City in 1945 and then not developing it any further and just letting people still go there. And then they brag and they say, oh yeah, 90% of the people own your own building. But if I'm the government and I give you all the buildings, then it's up to you to put the fixes in, And how are you going to do that? So, I mean, water's a real issue. Water's a real issue. And for us, it was a little different because we were staying in places where the government was making sure that there was water stockpiles there for us. Just like Steve said, there is a lot of tourism. It's just the Americans that aren't getting to experience it. But there's a lot of European tourism everywhere. Canadian, yeah. Canadian.
Joke, we heard that the definition of a Canadian to Cubans is what? Answer is an American that can travel to Cuba.
They're going to resorts where these golf courses are. They're not, spending time in the city like we were when we were there.
Yeah. In the slums.
Were you able to travel freely without an interpreter?
Oh yeah, that's hard. I mean, you speak Spanish.
Yeah, I think, language, if you go to Cuba, brush off your Spanish book. I think that's one of the big problems. And we were lucky to have Javier with us, who's bilingual.
Yeah.
If the rumors are true that Cubans are really nice, and they'll talk to you. And so I thought it was fairly easy to go out and walk around. You can't talk. I mean, I only know broken Spanish, and that's probably an overstatement. I did make some basic actually.
Yeah. First, I don't know precision about language. I wouldn't say that Cuba is a dictatorship because following that name would be terrorism that are usually part of a dictatorship government, civil government. So we're gonna end up, generating another sort of vision of a country which is ruled by a revolutionary government, which is different for a lot of other countries.
Well, that was something we had discussions about because that was a generational difference. Because I didn't grow up thinking Cuba was an equal place.
Yeah, well, I think in Venezuela, I heard sometimes people calling that a dictatorship or close to a dictatorship, but it's also a revolutionary government and a democratic government. So, but my question is to you: do you think that if Cuba opens after less than a year, if it becomes like stop the blockage, right? Do you think, which is my fear if that happens, that in less than a year Cuba will be another like Florida or Puerto Rico in the best case, and a country that doesn't have poor people because everybody has health and education, which is automatically not poor people. We'll start looking at those social differences after less than a year because capitalism will get into the Iceland and we'll start like breaking all those guarantees that people have despite all the bad things
know that's not going to happen. People love the revolution and they won't let that happen.
But it'll probably end up more like France.
But one thing that the embargo...
Just to be honest, I think so, more like France.
One thing that the embargo has kept out, not oil, but also all of our cheap food. Like we're not flooding their food system with all of our subsidized crap. And so that's another factor to why they've been able to implement some of these things there at a local level.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that actually. I don't know if this is the kind of thing you would know at all, but if you know anything about the amount of food aid that they get. I know that you said that they have food aid and it's like foreign imports of food, but how much food aid do they actually get?
Well, we know that roughly between 60 and 80% comes in. Okay, we don't, and that's.
How much comes in for free?
We don't know. We don't know. You probably could dig that out. But we don't.
And it's not. It's nothing like here where there's like food shelters or food banks. I mean, their ration system, which is soon to be dissolved, is ridiculous. I mean, you get a ration. If you have a child that's 2 months old, your 2-month-old child gets a coffee ration per month. So I mean, what 2-month-old child drinks coffee? So a lot of stuff's. Yeah, that's a good point. So they have a system that's broken, and I think that a lot of them are really concerned and fearful of how are we going to sustain our foodways in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
A full list of agronomist podcasts are available at the Department of Agronomy website, www.agron.iastate.edu.